I guess we should get started. So, on behalf of Central Europe University and the Gender Studies Department, I'm very honored to be able to welcome Susan Stryker to give a talk for us today. I'm particularly pleased that this is in cooperation with the LGBT History Month here, and that we've been able to continue our cooperation with the History Month and its organizers for another year. We think that this is a really important moment, a chance to bring different communities together and to bring important activists and scholars like Professor Stryker to our larger audience. And I, as representative of the LGBT History Month organizers, pass the official introduction to Tomasz Dom.
So I also welcome you here. It's nice that there's such a nice turnout, even for an academic lecture, which we were going to have today. Susan has already been part of the LGBT History Month as someone who opened the LGBT History Month this year, commenting on the movie The Danish Girl, which she was a consultant for. But we asked her also not just to do a short intro for the History Month, but also to come here and speak to you and provide you with the good insights that she has over the history and presence of trans issues in the United States and generally in world culture and media. Susan has a background in history, so she's a historian herself. She got her PhD from Berkeley and then went on to work both in academia. She's currently working for the University of Arizona, where she's a professor for Gender Studies and also a director of the LGBT Institute there. But she's also been working as an activist in various organizations, including the LGBT Historical Society of San Francisco, also directing various movies and publishing not just in academic journals, but also in a more popular format. So she's really the kind of scholar that tries to bring together academia and activism. So we really look forward to hearing what she has to say today. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks for coming. Making a lot of noise. All right. Well, I was asked to give an academic lecture, so I'm going to give an academic lecture. I was also just noticing as I was reviewing my talk that every time this is the piece I'm working on right now. I've given it 2 or 3 times. I change it a little every time that I do it. And I was just noticing that there was one paragraph that was sort of left dangling. So if you see me stumbling for a second, it's like I'm trying to suture together a part of the talk that I didn't quite connect up properly. But don't let that throw you. Okay, here we go. You ready? Every breath a trans person takes is an act of revolution. Those are not my words. They are words I first heard spoken in January 2015 at a Black Lives Matters conference, spoken by a woman, Lourdes Hunter, a black trans woman from the United States who describes herself as a healer, orator, academic, and educator, a descendant of enslaved Africans, freedom fighters, and liberators, a community organizer and co-founder of the Trans Women of Color Collective, established in 2013 to combat the pervasive and persistent violence experienced by people like herself. More recently, this slogan now appears in her social media as "Every breath a trans person of color takes is an act of revolution." My talk tonight takes place in the space between these two statements. I would like to pause for a moment tonight as a white transgender person at this moment in history, when transgender issues are bursting into greater visibility, to reflect on the confluence of transgender politics, the politics of race, the politics of alliance, particularly in the contemporary United States, but hopefully in ways that are not merely provincial to North America. It's important to honor the racial specificity of the resistance offered by the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement that took shape in the context of Trayvon Martin's murder by the vigilante George Zimmerman in Florida in 2012, the police murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and numerous other high-profile killings of unarmed black citizens in New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Cincinnati, Texas, San Francisco, and elsewhere over the last few years. It specifically addresses anti-black structural violence. Co-optations of this slogan, such as the universalist statement, "All lives matter," or well-intentioned imitative parallelisms focusing on other oppressed groups, such as Brown Lives Matters, Migrant Lives Matters, or Trans Lives Matter, and especially the reactionary pro-police Blue Lives Matters, all fail to acknowledge the existence of state and extrajudicial violence that takes aim at blackness in particular, and all fail to acknowledge as well the labor and intentions of the 3 black women who launched Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza. All lives are not allowed to matter in the same ways. Lives that are disallowed differently from one another. And lives that are disallowed as black are disallowed in some ways that are not shared by other disallowed lives. We are not, in fact, all Berliners, as US President John Kennedy said at the height of the Cold War in 1963. We are not all New Yorkers post 9/11. We are not all Khaled Said. We are not all Charlie Hebdo. At this moment in history, when it feels so vital to generate socio-political critique that addresses multiple specific forms of structural violence, how might we best think and act together so that each of us is not alone in our struggles, yet we do not mischaracterize the struggles of others as distorted mirrors of our own? The Black Lives Matter movement is explicitly trans-affirming, stating on its website that, quote, "We are committed to embracing and making space for trans brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We are committed to being self-reflexive and doing the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence." I understand the place that Lourdes Hunter, who I quoted to begin this talk, has in Black Lives Matters, but I wrestle from my position as a white trans person with how best to move towards trans justice without reproducing white privilege in the context of an intersectional movement. So, to begin again, from where we began a moment ago. Every breath a trans person takes is an act of revolution. Why an act of revolution? The only large sample survey of trans people in North America finds that we are 4 times more likely than the general population to live in extreme poverty, that more than half of us have experienced significant rejection from our families, that nearly half of us are undocumented because we cannot change name and gender markers on state-issued identification documents. We experience more than twice the rate of homelessness, twice the rate of HIV infection, and more than 50% greater rates of incarceration than the population at large. Nearly half of us, 41%, have been so hurt by what the world can do to trans people that we attempt suicide, compared with an attempted suicide rate of less than 4% in the general population. Unsurprisingly, the rates of all such negative consequences of being trans are significantly higher among Black and Indigenous peoples, and somewhat higher among other racially minoritized trans people who live in the crosshairs of multiple systemic oppressions than they are among trans people who are white. But we should not allow the uneven distribution of these injustices to obscure the fact that whatever the color of our skin, class of origin, income level, citizenship status, migration history, birth sex, gender of rearing, or level of educational and professional attainment, simply being perceived and categorized by others as transgender narrows the scope of our life's potential and exposes us to greater risk of premature death. I deliberately echo here Ruth Gilmore's definition of racism as, quote, the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, in order to highlight both the genealogical connection between, as well as the non-identity of, race and sex classifications within contemporary biopolitical regimes. I draw methodological inspiration from Ecuadorian transfeminists Ana Almeida and Elizabeth Vasquez, who in their book, Distintos Cuerpos, Different Bodies, which recounts their 8 years of activism among sex workers, trans women, feminists, and street gangs, developed the concept of subjacent symmetries through which they seek to grasp the common roots of distinct oppressions. I draw inspiration as well from cultural theorist Felix Guattari's concept of transversality, which can similarly be used to advance a critical social justice analysis, not through direct analogies between differently subjugated embodiments, race is not sex, is not ability, but rather by moving across categories of embodied specificity, trans, and bringing them into relation only through turning the focus of attention, verso, to a precursor condition informing both differences. To the extent that transgender people of whatever color are conceived of and treated as biologically differentiated from cisgender people, that is, as a different type or kind of biological being than a non-transgender person, transphobic violence is indeed a racializing violence, to the extent that we understand race not narrowly as color or ethnicity, but more broadly as a spurious biologization of culturally salient bodily differences. This is precisely Foucault's concept of racialization as the fundamental biopolitical process. It is the introduction of a caesura, a break or a rupture, into a heterogeneous population that becomes the principle of differentiation between those bodies accorded greater capacities for life and those whose lives are disallowed. It bears mentioning here that the Latin root of the word sex means to divide, while the Latin root for the word gender means kind or type. Thus, when we speak of a sex-gender system, we are talking at root about a system for dividing and classifying bodies and arranging them in hierarchies, which is to say, we are talking about biopolitics, pure and simple. Perhaps because we are so accustomed to conflating race with color, it would be best to call structural violence directed against trans people of whatever color, as well as structural violence against people of color, whether they are cis or trans, as a speciating violence, a violence that cuts between those deemed to be more human and those deemed to be less. Such speciating violences do the work of sorting bodies into hierarchies according to supposedly fixed and immutable physical criteria through what disability theorist Ellen Samuels calls fantasies of identification. Fantasies that the evidence of, this is that point, what disability theorist Ellen Samuels calls fantasies of identification that evidence our belief that bodies offer stable grounds for social classification and our desire to stabilize hierarchical social structures in bodily difference. Every breath that a trans person takes is an act of revolution. Why? Because when the structures of the existing world are such that they more readily steer you towards mortality than vitality, yet you nevertheless love your own life and the lives of those you love, when you have quadrupled the poverty rate and 10 times the suicide rate of members of the general population, then every breath you take as a trans person is an act of revolution. Each breath insists on a new ordering of the world. I I have been repeating Lourdes Hunter's phrases and words. Every breath a trans person takes is an act of revolution because they inspire me. I want to breathe them in and feel them move me as I share some struggles and am near to others. I want to conspire with her words, to breathe with them, alongside them. And in repeating them, chanting them like an incantation, every breath a trans person takes is an act of revolution. I want you to conspire with them too. At a moment in history when tens of thousands of people recently have marched in the streets of New York City in righteous anger, chanting as their rallying cry the words that an unarmed black man named Eric Garner uttered as he lay dying in a police chokehold, "I can't breathe." It seems that some of us are indeed finding new ways to conspire, to breathe together, to conspire in insurrectionary resistance and opposition to state-sanctioned and extrajudicial violence directed at bodies deemed unworthy of life for whatever reason. At such a moment in history, we would do well to recall the words of Frantz Fanon in A Dying Colonialism, written in 1959 in reference to the Algerian Revolution, quote, "There is not occupation of territory on the one hand and independence of persons on the other. It is the country as a whole, its history, its daily pulsations that are contested, disfigured, in the hope of a final destruction. Under this condition, the individual's breathing is an observed and occupied breathing. It is a combat breathing." Fanon's concept of combat breathing increased its critical traction in the US after being promulgated by black feminist playwright and poet Ntozake Shange in the 1980s. And it has been embraced more recently by Alexis Gumbs in her online participatory political art project, the Revolutionary Black Feminist Breathing Chorus. But the concept is not original to Fanon. Combat breathing, or tactical breathing, as it is sometimes called, is a technique common to many forms of hand-to-hand martial arts. Proper control of the breath can literally add power to a punch, help reduce injury when receiving a blow, and rejuvenate a fatigued body. The fundamentals of combat breathing are quite simple: to be consistently aware of fatigue level and to adjust respiration as needed to keep the lungs at least half full, to exhale forcefully when attacking, and to inhale at every possible opportunity, gulping air in rapidly and letting it hiss out slowly. In using the term combat breathing, Fanon and those who have followed him are not merely suggesting that the very breath of the colonized body is under assault. Rather, they are advocating for the instrumentalization of a contested necessity of life as a resistant and defiant act of survival. Fanon's words call our attention to the relationship between territory and population, as well as to the relationship between the techniques through which populations are managed and the techniques through which individual bodies are disciplined, and hence, once again, to biopolitics. Fanon's words served as an epigraph for the first issue of Somatechnics, a journal dedicated to transdisciplinary scholarship on the always already technologized nature of embodiment, including such materio-discursive technologies of embodiment as racialization and the production of sexed and gendered subjectivities, social technologies that produce the identity categories that enable the biopolitical apparatus to operate, to reproduce nation, empire, and capital as they circulate through our bodies by harnessing our energies and conscripting our movements. As Suvendrini Pereira and Joseph Pugliese noted in their introduction to that first issue of Somatechnics, the entirety of Fanon's literary corpus brings into sharp focus the indissociable relationship between disciplinary operations performed on individual embodied lives and the management of bodies politic, between technologies of state violence and the enfleshed bodies upon which such technologies operate. In the passage I quoted above, they remind us, Fanon asserts that bodies targeted by state violence are rendered so expendable, their fundamental capacity to exist placed in such jeopardy, that respiration literally becomes the site of struggle. The target subject's energies so fully committed to mere physical survival that it can scarcely resist, contest, or subvert the power of the state. Scarcely is the key word here. For targeted bodies do indeed engage in combat, do not submit utterly to asymmetrical violence, do not with their very breath defy the necropolitical imperative to cease living, and instead marshal vitality itself as a baseline potential for oppositional and transformational social projects. Is it possible, Pereira and Pugliese ask, to identify points at which a techniques of state violence fails in its encounter with the recalcitrant biomateriality of bodies that persist in remaining other, excessive, inscrutable, and in flight, regardless of that body's capillary penetration by relations of power hostile to the life it might otherwise live? Yes. It is precisely here, in attending closely to the daily micro-political struggles of living a targeted body's life, in examining the various techniques through which the lives of such bodies are shunted hither or yon towards greater violence or increased reward. It is here, in linking such analysis to possibilities for action that bend us towards justice, towards a better life, that we can begin to transversely articulate an emergent trans politics with longer established structural injustices that have targeted other disparaged acts of bodily being in the world. It is here that we can find subjacent symmetries. It is here that we can begin engaging with trans histories and envisioning trans futurities in the context of different differences that also matter. If you were at the Danish Girl screening the other night, you would have heard me say this paragraph. I'm going to say it again. I'm fond of paraphrasing a passage in Friedrich Nietzsche's The Uses and Abuses of History for the Present. If the rich and powerful have any use whatsoever for history, he says, it is as a raw material to build a monument to their own greatness. Most people, he continues, have a merely nostalgic relationship to their past. They look there for something that feels comfortable and familiar. Only those who are crushed by a present circumstance, he concludes, and who are determined at all cost to throw off the yoke of their oppression, have any need for a critical historiography. My goal is to produce just such a critical historiography. As long as trans people, as a category of people, are categorically exposed to greater violence and precarity than comparable groups of non-transgender people, we risk our lives by failing to understand the roots and methods of this subjugation, just as we fail to make that critical knowledge of our history significant if we do not link it to liberatory practices, and just as we fail to make such struggles just if we do not understand them to be rooted in a deeper struggle that also involves persons different from ourselves. A critical history of transgender cannot be limited to simply tracing the emergence of transgender identities across the past few centuries, but rather with recognizing transgender capacities for the disruption of established categories of being from within, and with identifying the conditions of possibility for such emergent phenomena to appear. Whether in the West or the rest of the world, when what we might call transgender phenomena flare into visibility, they allow us to see in a flash, if perhaps only for an instant, a possible path that life might take, moving in new directions. When the new academic journal TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, adopted the phrase, "We're changing gender," as its marketing slogan, this is precisely what the editors had in mind. The critical goal is not merely to advocate for greater ease in changing gender in the sense of moving with less friction from one point in a sex-gender system to another, but rather to critique how sex-gender operates as a system of biopolitical governance, with the goal of changing it in ways that create better odds for surviving and thriving, for bodies that live lives disruptive of dominant forms of social organization. A great deal going on in contemporary popular culture in the US suggests that gender is indeed undergoing an intensified period of change. Since the summer of 2014, when Time magazine announced in a cover story that, quote, America is at a transgender tipping point, and what does that even mean? Transgender issues have attained an unprecedented level of mass media visibility. The rise of Caitlyn Jenner as a media spectacle has created an audience of tens of millions attuned to whether the former Olympic athlete will be able to keep up with the Kardashians as a woman. Transgender filmmaker Lana Wachowski's Netflix series, Sense8, features a transgender actress, Jamie Clayton, in a transgender role. The Amazon Prime television show Transparent has a 98% favorability rating on most crowdsourced media review websites and has become the first televised series to win multiple Emmy and Golden Globe Awards for transgender-themed content. Oscar winner Eddie Redmayne is currently starring in a movie adaptation of David Ebershoff's The Danish Girl, a novelization of the life of Lily Elba, who became one of the first surgically and hormonally transformed transgender people in the 1930s. It certainly seems that transgender issues have attained an unprecedented level of mass media visibility. But then again, every time I've written that sentence over the past 20 years, it seemed true then as well. Are we seeing anything truly new? Anything other than the continuingly unfolding logic of biopolitical modernity, which perpetually renders transgender phenomena as a spectacular hypervisibility? Are we seeing anything other than macro-political economic power devising new administrative practices for capturing the slippery fish of emergent identities, increasing speed and efficiency through flexible strategies of categorization? What, if anything, is actually tipping, and what might we be tipping towards? I'm suspicious of how the concept of a transgender tipping point, which we might want to consider as the pivot away from history and towards futurity, can be folded into a progress narrative that is anything but the kind of critical history that Nietzsche championed. For many years now, lesbian and gay rights have been held up as a symbol of Western freedom and perversely harnessed through what Jesbir Puar has called homo-nationalism to many racist and colonialist practices of state, such as justifying European resistance to Muslim immigration from the Middle East and North Africa, partially on the grounds that their cultures are homophobic, or Israel's pinkwashing of its occupation of Palestine, in part through its promotion of itself as a modern gay Mecca, the only beacon of freedom in a region of the world dominated by oppressive and reactionary regimes. As gay and lesbian rights to fully participate in civil society win increasing acceptance, including the rights to marry and serve openly in the military, transgender issues, positioned as being more extreme or more marginalized than homosexuality, now come to be depicted as the next frontier of liberty. It's necessary to resist the historical narrative in which transgender's tipping point means simply that it is now available for co-optation by Western powers eager to trumpet their progressiveness and superiority in relation to the rest of the world, that it has crossed over some kind of chronological divide and can now be instrumentalized for the very state projects that have inflicted such violence on transgender people themselves. But there is another way to articulate transgender with the idea of a tipping point through the concept of the anthropocene, a new era of planetary history demarcated by the effect of human beings on Earth, that perhaps merits greater sympathy and may hold greater critical promise. Geologists now point out that if we can imagine an observer of planet Earth millions of years hence, that observer would be able to see a geological stratum marked by increased levels of radiation from nuclear fallout, by the presence of plastics and the byproducts of plastic breakdown in sedimentary formations, by massive amounts of concrete and aluminum, by a sudden redistribution of species in the fossil record. That will be most of what's left of the planet's surface from the time when our species has existed upon it. Those artifacts attest to how profoundly we humans are currently transforming our world. Given that the climate change we are now experiencing is almost entirely anthropogenic, what better hope for a future that might contain anything descended from us in it than to address the planetary tipping point we are now experiencing by abandoning what human has heretofore meant and done, or to transform the human into something radically new and see what different and maybe better thing it might become. Transgender in this view can perhaps best be conceptualized as a radical will to life in the face of an ever-evolving biophysical and socio-technical environment that is often hostile to its flourishing. If a critical appraisal of transgender history teaches us that its narrative is largely driven by a will to exclude from life bodies deemed unsuitable for the perpetuation of the dominant modes of social organization, if we acknowledge that the human is a socially privileged status fully accorded only to those members of our species capable of occupying those dominant modes of social organization, rather than simply being a name for the species itself, if we refuse to deny that the human is the principal mechanism through which we now produce our species' deathscape, then the very capacity of bodies that lead transgender lives to be outside the human, whether in abjection or excess, flight or exile, aligns those lives with the prospect of a future. They attest to cosmic possibilities for wild and rapturous becomings writ small. When we engage in combat breathing, we fight for something bigger than our own individual life. We survive and resist for something vital yet indiscernible, something monstrous and unfathomable, something which is yet to come. I'm unwilling to speculate much about the shape of such a future. As Franco Berardi notes in After the Future is not merely a time that has yet to come to pass. Within modernity, as well as within many ancient religious traditions, the future serves the ideological function of containing all of our displaced failures to resolve current crises. The promised one will come, the state will wither away, we shall have our freedom when the revolution comes. Since the 1970s, Berardi claims, after the emergence of neoliberal capitalism and its subsequent hegemonic transnationalization seemed to have left us no exit on the macro-political scale, it's become impossible to believe in the future in that way. The punk sensibility in popular culture that proclaims no future heralds precisely this shift towards a refusal of belief in any program for social transformation that pins its hope on that which is yet to come. This is not a nihilistic stance, so much as it is an insistence that our attention should be focused sharply on the here and now, that we should explore our options for carrying on without belief in a particular redemption story, without a conviction that we must succeed somehow, believing only that whatever change can come comes only from within the current securitization of life and not from a liberatory beyond. That we must move laterally and in an experimental and improvisational fashion rather than moving forward with a faith in progress. We must be attuned to emergent possibilities, to virtualities that have never been materialized, but which might yet be summoned into being. Within such world historical circumstances, when the profit-fueled motivations of environmental degradation and the combined calamities of capitalism, colonialism, and racism, along with all their attendant social pathologies, wreak havoc on such a monumental scale that hopelessness is not irrational. It's easy to withdraw into the merely personal, to be absorbed and distracted by mass media, to eat comfort food, and seek only a nostalgic connection to the past. Perhaps this is the only way to preserve oneself and our world. Perhaps this is then the only place to begin moving towards whatever world will come. Perhaps our critical engagement should start precisely here, within the micropolitics of our quotidian bodily being in the world, with our daily practices of eating and sleeping and breathing and moving, searching for something viral and scalable that can transmigrate towards others at an order of magnitude that exceeds the individual. Perhaps at this moment in history, we have nowhere else to look. Felix Guattari characterized such micro-political transformations as molecular revolutions, which he believed complemented rather than opposed traditional notions of social revolution. Quote, "Changes do not have to come about from large-scale socioeconomic conditions," he wrote in his mid-1970s essay, "I Am an Idea Thief." Quote, "Molecular mutations do not always assert themselves on a large scale, and they must be gauged differently in the short term. But this does not mean they do not exist. We do not have the same relations to reading, writing, images, space, sex, the body, the night, the sun, to pain, as we had only 10 years ago. Profound and irreversible mutations are underway in all these areas. In other words, the molecular substratum on which all large social collectives are inscribed has become something of a bubbling soup." In thinking thus, Guattari echoes Foucault's notion of a counterconduct, a concept Foucault developed to explain the relationship between individual comportment and larger geopolitical concerns during the wars of religion in early modern European history. The reason that Christian baptism by sprinkling versus dunking, or a man wearing his beard short rather than long, or some other such doctrinal decree about permissible modes of moving or cultivating one's body, could become a cause for war, the reason that they could become a cause for war had everything to do with the techniques of governance on which the modern West depends. Comporting one's body in one manner rather than another, said in actions, if not in words, that one was willing to be conducted by certain men in certain ways towards certain political ends. Conducting one's body counterwise to that socio-somatic assemblage is in fact the beginnings of political resistance, an announcement of a will to be moved differently, to be led by others, or perhaps led by no one at all, towards new and different ends. Like a lot of other middle-class white people in North America, I've practiced a westernized, hybridized version of yoga-like stretching and meditation exercises for many years. And I have, as an adult, learned some Sanskrit words for things that my body had already taught me long ago. For example, we tend to think of breathing as a two-part process. We inhale, we exhale. But breathing is really fourfold. We inhale, we pause. We exhale, we pause. It takes a beat of time for the bellows of the lungs to reverse direction. The rhythm of the gathering and the letting go of breath thus includes the space between the breath. That space between, so unmindfully hurried through, can be expanded and amplified through conscious attention and active practice. In Sanskrit, pranayama, the extension or drawing out of the life force through conscious attention to the breath. Kumbhaka pranayama, attention to the breath through the practice of retaining or holding one's breath. Antar-kumbhaka, the cessation of breath once inhalation is complete. Vayakumbhaka, the cessation of breath once exhalation is complete. The voluntary cessation of breath is perhaps the most important physical technique for calming the chattering mind in order to consciously experience meditative absorption, samadhi. It is the opposite of combat breathing. It is the other side of the coin. As an adolescent, I swam. Starting around age 10, when we moved to a new town and both of my parents worked full-time jobs, the swimming pool at the YMCA became my babysitter each summer, all summer long. I was dropped off in the morning, picked up in the late afternoon. By 13, when my father died, the water had become an important refuge, albeit one that I could attain only after having passed through the locker room. That sex-segregated space of total nakedness was a psychologically brutal gauntlet for a young, pre-transitional, transgender-identified person to pass through, and the public semi-nakedness of the swimsuit hardly less excruciating. But I accepted both conditions as the price to be paid for accessing a space that I needed in another way. I reveled in the freedom of three-dimensional underwater movement, a freedom possible for precisely as long as I could hold my breath. I practiced training myself to extend the duration of breath retention to maximize the time that I could spend in the spaces between. I could detach from and, in solitude, observe there my father's absence, my mother's distress, my own dysphoric relation to embodiment, the suffocating pervasiveness of social gendering, and instead take a fundamental pleasure in a greater capacity for movement, moving in a way impossible to move on the terrestrial plane. Play space, tumbling in dream time, philosophizing, world building, refiguring as I moved. I could contemplatively experience the fact that the liquid environment that enabled such joy was simultaneously unlivable for any great length of time, while the gaseous environment that I returned to, the atmosphere, to sustain life in the physical dimension, threatened social and psychical death for my own most vital sense of self. As a child, I cultivated an amphibious disposition, moving ceaselessly between things that killed me and enlivened me in different ways, at different rates and different speeds. Amphibian in its roots, ambi plus bios, means to have two kinds of life. I meditate now on this amphibian nature, aquatically mammalian, off-center from the human, while lying in meditation, shavasana, the corpse pose. At my day job, I intellectualize the necessary discoveries of my childhood as a methodological transgender art of living. Most of what is nothing, the feminist physicist Karen Barad reminds us. Atoms, like galaxies, are mostly empty space, a void teeming with quantum virtualities playing out their possibilities in the darkness of unbeing, such that mattering is but an infinite exploration of infinite potential becomings. Mattering, no idle pun on materiality and semiosis, but rather an insistence on the ongoing onto-ethical epistemological entanglement of matter and meaning. Matter literally emerges from the void, from the interstices, from the space between. In a similar vein, more prosaic but no less cosmic in its implications, Martin Heidegger writes in his 1962 essay, The Thing, about an ordinary jug in order to address the question of being's emergence from the void. It is not the sides or bottom of the jug that accomplish the act of holding or containing, Heidegger contends, but rather the empty space. It is the void, the no thing, alongside the jug's thinginess that holds. Heidegger notes further that it is only in the act of spilling forth that which has been held by the jug's action of holding that the act of holding finds completion. This outpouring from the void takes the form of a gift that gathers what belongs to the giving. For Heidegger, the outpoured gift gathers what he suggestively calls, given the four-part biomechanics of human breathing, the fourfold, by which he means a double union of earth and sky, divinities and mortals. The overtly theological framework of this formulation notwithstanding, Heidegger's vision of a gushing void, of a capacious outpouring from nothingness, of a something that is the materialization of many gathered potentials, solicits me. It speaks to my sense of all life as a fundamental process of grasping virtual possibilities, immanent in the organization of the material world, but as yet unrealized within it, which being is capable of bringing forth. It is within our capacity as living entities to recognize that which is not yet, but which yet might actually be, and to bring it into being through our actions, both personal and collective. Every breath that a trans person takes is an act of revolution, and each fourfold breath contains the space between. Of necessity, we breathe to live and live to dream. We detach from struggles and engage in combat for lives worth living to persist. Thank you. This is always the terrifying part of the evening. It's like,
Not so bad. Thank you very much. Perhaps I can suggest we can take questions,
Yeah.
and I can go around with a microphone so that people can be heard. Do you want to field them yourself, and I'll just
Sure.
after whoever?
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, terrific.
You be Phil Donahue, I'll be whatever.
So questions?
I see a hand over there.
I missed the first part, so I didn't hear if you're an author or what do you work as.
What do I work as? You start with the tough questions. My PhD's in history, so I tend to think, my brain got cut into those grooves. I think about change over time. I'm also a filmmaker, so I play with time, cutting it up in different ways. And my day job is running the Institute for LGBT Studies at the University of Arizona, where I'm also a professor of women and gender studies. And my main field of study is on transgender whatever. It's spelled Trans asterisk, which is pronounced trans whatever. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. It sometimes was also a very nice performance, like slam poetry or something similar. And I would like to ask you about how do you think we can reach beyond the choir when we try to open eyes, which is of course a difficult issue in case of all prejudices, but perhaps the issue you have been talking about is even more difficult than some others. But
Yeah.
of course we should go for it still.
Yeah,
So,
how do we reach beyond the choir when we're trying to make change. And I don't know, like maybe this is the cynical or pessimistic part of me. It's like I think like most large-scale movements for social change have foundered. It's like in that there's a kind of hopelessness about the possibilities for large-scale change, which is why I think maybe it's actually not hopeless to do the thing that is often thought of as a retreat from the political, like to really think in personal ways about the way you live your body in the world, and to bring that kind of, critical, mindful attention to what we reproduce when we exist the way we exist as an individual body, and to begin to find those places that are actually subjects of agency for us. It's like I can't stop climate change. It's like I can't help who's going to be president of the United States, at the end of the year. It's just like I can't. It's beyond my capacity. But there are things that I feel like I can do for myself that's not like a mere retreat, but is actually like trying to find things in social assemblage, like to find things that it's like are within my ability to do that link to other people doing things at the micro political scale, and to find ways that, like I said, become infectious, that are like that virally transmit themselves from you to others or from others to you, so that you begin to assemble in the sort of Guattarian molecular revolution fashion a new kind of body politic. And that it's not something that you know in advance. It's like it's not something where you have a program and you say, this is what freedom looks like, this is what justice looks like. It's like it's working at that quotidian level in ways that you begin to find agency, promote your life, increase life capacity of some kind in a way that is looking for something outside of the biopolitical arrangement of life in the present, and we don't know what it is in advance, So I see preaching to the choir. It's like, I don't know, maybe the choir's the only thing that's listening, but maybe that choir will develop a very loud voice, and more people will join into that song to beat that metaphor with the last. Get the last ounce of usefulness out of it. So, yeah, traveling hopelessly but not nihilistically, I guess, is what I would say we have to do.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I was thinking about, you were talking about the instrumentalization of like trans movements or LGBT movements in general for your political purposes. And I was interested in that issue because as a person who is just cisgender, and how can you support the movement without like ruining it, or without using it in a wrong way, or without how to advance the cause without making it about you?
I mean, this is exactly the same question that I feel like I ask as a white person about, other racializations of precarious life. And I think a lot of it comes down to a kind of humility, a kind of being with, but not necessarily being for others. Just like it's witnessing. It's like it's being there in a companionate kind of way. It's like it's about recognizing what the other person's struggle is and asking what you can do for that. Rather than feeling like it's about you at some level, or feeling like you have the answer. It's like it's just I think of it as a kind of a practice of companionate humility, and a constant interrogation of how you cannot diminish the scope of another person's life through your own actions. I mean, that's what it comes down to for me. And again, you don't know what it is in advance, because like you're always unlearning the kinds of privilege that you've been blinded by. And so how do you create the space of being nearby, of witnessing, but not trying to drive what's happening? You know, how do you create the detachment that allows you to have an analytical capacity and a space for ethical reflection and a space for tactical and strategic engagement? You know, so I mean, there's no magic bullet. You know, there's only that constant, you know, ethical self-critique.
Thank you for your talk. You also mentioned this in your Friday talk, and it caught my ears. You said that there was this, what's her name, a model who came out as a trans woman, and that gave a great visibility to the trans community. And I was wondering how trans women who are kind of, you know, white, blonde-haired, photo model-like appearance serve more diverse, you know, members of the trans community. So does it do? Who does it do too? Or
yeah. So how do like pretty, skinny, white, blonde trans women serve the rest of the community? Not well. Not well. You know, I think this is the new historical moment that we're in right now, that until quite, well, I was saying this in the interview that I gave just before the talk today, that there's a queer social scientist and critic that I like very much, Gail Rubin, you know, who's been around for a long time now. In her article Thinking Sex, you know, that she writes about how you know, sexual minority, gender minority identity categories, as she says, march out of the pages of the diagnostic and statistical manuals and into the pages of social history, and that process, you know, is usually one where, you know, power takes hold of a minoritized position. It says you're this minority, pathological, stigmatized thing, and then people who are called that develop a reverse discourse and say, you know, yes, I am that, but it's not bad, it's good, and then you engage in, you know, social struggle to create, you know, greater opportunities for life for people who are categorized as that thing. And eventually, over time, what happens is it becomes contested, that it's not, you know, gay is not strictly pathological. It's something that, you know, there's a big social, you know, conversation about. And then at some point, these stigmatized things become routinized. They become standard deviations. They become a different way towards the normal, an acceptable variation. And that what we're seeing happen with trans right now is that until quite recently in the US, there was not any legitimated way to be trans. You know, it's like you were totally stuck on this is a social pathology side of the equation. And that over the last 20 to 25 years, there's been a lot of struggle going on about that. And now, I think, somewhat after 9/11, but particularly after 2014, 2015, what we're seeing for the very first time in history is that there is an okay way to be trans in the US. You know, you can be a normative citizen. You know, there's like approved pathways for changing your sex gender designation. There are government-funded body transformation procedures. There are civil rights. There's positive media representation. That is totally new. That is the situation. But to go back to the Foucauldian biopolitical framework, what biopolitics does is it sorts people into categories. It splits categories, and it regroups them in these ever-shifting ways. So what's happening right now is, for the first time, you have the chance to be, good trans or stigmatized trans. That good option didn't exist until quite recently. And so I think it does a disservice, to say things like, oh, we've got trans freedom and liberty now. It's like, we don't. It's like only a small fraction of the population gathered under the sign of transgender has the privileges of a newfound social normativity, and that that trans category is just splitting along all of the traditional divisions of the body politic, along race, along ability, along class. It's like, so that I think it's impossible to talk about transgender justice and have it mean any one thing. It's like it's always dealing with the intersectional forms of oppression within the category that you're trying to do your politics around. So the best that can happen, I think, for the normatively appearing, economically empowered trans women, the best that can happen is that they do what people who have any kind of privilege always need to do, which is to direct the resources available to them through that very privilege to addressing the kinds of structural injustices that other members of their category don't have to contend with. So that's my answer.
Hello. I really like your concept of lateral futures. I think it's like advancing, but in a situated way, the cause for, trans futures. But my question is, where do you stand, for example, there is this thing called the anti-social thesis in queer theory, right? Wherein some like Edelman and Halberstam, they don't believe in futures, they believe in negativity, antagonism, and the other side is like queer utopias, like Munoz, and the other. So how do you situate your view in this?
I stand with Jose Munoz. Okay. No, I mean, it's like, I feel like, critique is vital, the negative is vital. It's like, it has its place, but, I feel like if all we do is say what we can't do and why everything is, just like fucked up, then what do you do? It's like you have to live, right? And so it's like the idea of having something that you want to live towards, at least as like an affect that you prefer to have, rather than the horribleness that you need to critique. It's like I'm much more on the disidentification and then cruising towards utopia mode than I am in the no future. I mean, I think there is no future, but I think if all we're doing is being like sad, angry militants telling everybody like how we're so much smarter than everybody else because we understand how deeply messed up things are, it's like, I mean, there's a place for that. It's like critique is really important. And, what are you living for?
Thank you very much for the talk. I especially liked your analogy to breathing and resistance. I really very much like that part. My question is about the relationship between religion and being transgender in US context especially. Like religion in public life has very much effect in politics. And I wonder how religions in US, not only Christianity but other religions, has connections with trans people and how trans people has connections. I'm from Turkey and we have one of the most famous trans person in Turkey is a singer, and she often uses like
Bülent Ersoy?
Bülent Ersoy, yes.
Yeah.
And she, for example, during Ramadan, she, for example, sings religious hymns, and she often declares herself as a pious Muslim, and it's accepted quite, like many people loves her. I don't know whether it's because people love her or whether it's, I don't know if her personality maybe is more important for the people than her transgender, but how is it in maybe US context?
Yeah,
this relationship?
it's dangerous for me to talk about cultures that I don't know well. But at the risk of saying something stupid, what I understand of Ersoy's public performance of a trans womanhood is that there's a kind of acceptability in it because of the very sort of traditional and classical forms of music that she performs and performs well, so that it kind of functions as a demonstration of the state's capacity to absorb like many kinds of difference and maintain its, maintain its field of control in some ways, so that you could see the trans figure as potentially disruptive or as being, unvaluable or as being seditious, and so that it's a kind of dramatization of a state or nationalist capacity for taking in a kind of body, that it's sort of more powerful than the potential disruption of it. It's, what I would call a securitization of sex-gender difference. In the U.S., I don't know. There's a lot of times religion is presented as being only an element of sort of reactionary politics. And I think that, more and more this kind of, in some ways, like some of the work that I was trying to do in this piece and trying to think through, from my perspective, a kind of secular materialist ontology that has a capacity in it for, joyful becomings. I don't use a religious language for that, and I'm not a religious person, but it's like I do see many people who come from different religious traditions grappling in particular religious vocabularies and traditions with that same problem of how, like in the face of like everything that's, death dealing, like there's capacities for life and for new becoming in it. So like queer and trans religious studies is a really hot topic in the academy right now. I think that there's a way that we can critically reevaluate. I mean, for me, from a secular position, like to reevaluate the relationship between the secular, the sacred, between different religious traditions and a kind of, Western critical, secular social theory and philosophy. It's like a way to re-articulate the relationship between those things that it's like, you don't know where it goes, but it's an interesting way to go forward. So that's what I think. I think I'm excited by a potential for something different, and we'll wait and see how it happens.